To Siman Lamed Bey's Sif Dalet. Now, these halachas are actually very interesting because, while on the surface level they don't seem very practical, they're about kashrus of a tefillin. They're obviously much more related to sofrim, but the reason why they're important is because if you open up your tefillin one day and the sofer tells you a halacha, you could check now, and you could sort of say, well,
It also tells you how important it is to
correct.
find a good seif.
Correct. So the Mechaber says in Sif Dalet, you have to make sure the letters don't touch each other. Each letter has to be covered by klaf, surrounded by klaf, and if the letters touch each other, it's a problem. Then the Mishnah Berurah says, now let's say the letters are so big, and they're touching at a very, very tiny little angle, where when you were to remove, if you were to remove what they're touching, it would still be a clear letter. Meaning sometimes the letters are small, and they're so connected, where if I were to remove that, I lose the essence of the letters. That's not the case. The case is where there's a tiny touching, but if you remove that little tiny touching, it's still clear letters independent of that. Some say it's kosher even if they're touching, and some are machmer. And says the Mishnah Berurah, we are machmer. And therefore you have to remove, you have to scrape away the area that they connect. Now the interesting thing about that is, by tefillin it has to be written in order. So a lot of times when there's a psul, you can't just fix it, because if you're fixing it, it's as if you wrote that letter out of order. So seif Torah you can do that, but tefillin and mezuzahs you can't. But this area, this fixing of just scraping the little bit that's connected in such a situation, he says is mutar even by tefillin and mezuzahs. Now, before we go weiter, so if the letters touch each other, it's a problem. It's puzzle in general. So the Biur Halacha says, what about the tagim, the crowns on top? What if they're touching? So the Biur Halacha says, in Tzarech, let's say you have the crowns of the letter itself, right? A zayin has 3 crowns. Let's say 2 of the crowns are touching. So it says the Biur Halacha, it's puzzle. But let's say it's one tag is connecting to a tag of a different letter. So I have a zayin next to a nun, and the crown of the zayin is touching the crown of the nun. So the actual zayin is clear, the nun is clear, it's just the crowns that are touching. So he says, ha-me'iri mekel, the me'iri is lenient, va-magen avram pri chadash machmirim, they're machmir, and he says, you should be machmir if possible. But that would mean that if you were to check your tefillin, and that were to be the case, after the fact, you could feel less guilty, because you definitely have those what to rely on.
But that
now,
you can fix.
You could fix it. This is more just, was it puzzle? Obviously you could definitely fix it if possible. And he says, bevadil chachila, you should erase it. Now, the Ramah continues, v'yichtov ksiva tama, you have to make sure that the letters are written properly. What does that mean? The bays can't look like a chaf, and a chaf can't look like a bays, meaning this is not like A for effort. It has to be the proper letters. And sh'layechser afilu kutze shel yud, each letter has to be complete. You can't even miss a corner of a letter. It has to be written fully. Now the Mishnah Berurah says, the Ramah then says, and he also has to have the right tag and the right crowns. The Mishnah Berurah says, shatnas gates. The letters are shatnas gates. Shin, ayin, tes, nun, zayin, gimel, tzadi. Those are the letters that have crowns. Now having crowns is l'chachila. If you were to have a letter without the crowns, it is kosher b'di'evet. L'rova poskim. Now, this is actually in a gay. You'll find this with mezuzahs a lot. You'll find mezuzahs when you open it. For some reason, a lot of letters don't have crowns. It was not written l'chachila. And that's why often you'll have a mezuzah that the sofer will tell you, it's kosher, but get a new one. And that's some of the problems. The crowns are not there. And tefillin also, it's kosher without crowns. It's not mahudr, for sure. L'chachila yichtov ksiva gasa k'tzashli nemchakim mehera. It's better l'chachila to write a bigger letter, like thicker letters, so that they're not as easily erased, is not as easily removed. And it's beautiful. The better the ksav, the more beautiful the ksav. Zakeli vanveyu. Okay. The Mechaber says in Hey, you have to write with your right hand. Even if you're ambidextrous, you should write with your right hand. Vim kasav is small, and if a righty writes with his left hand, psulim. It's puzzle. As long as you have the alternative, it's puzzle. Ve'iter yad, it's interesting. He says, Im efshar limtzai achem ksum b'yamin. It's an interesting thing because it's like it's puzzle if you can find an alternative one. It's an interesting lashon. Now, when it says it's puzzle, that's when a righty writes it with his left hand. However, iter yad smolti day have yamin. A lefty should write it with his left hand. The point is, whatever is your more dominant hand, that's the proper form of writing. If you write with your left hand as a righty, that's an abnormal way of writing, and therefore it's not kosher. He says it's puzzle im efshar limtzoi acherim ksuvim biyamin. But it's an interesting lashon. Okay, let's just start the next one, if you don't mind. Sif vav, and that is sirtut. Sirtut is the obligation to line the klaf. Now, mezuzahs need sirtut on the top of each line of writing and on the sides, mamish to box it in. Mezuzahs need it. Sefer Torah is a machlokes, but we also paskin Sefer Torah needs sirtut. Tefillin does not. Now, tefillin is a little different. It says the Machaber, Ein tzarich l'sartit kim shita elyona. All you have to do by tefillin is the top line, technically. Now, why? It says in Mishnah Berurah, the tefillin ein aleh halacha Moshe Messinai. The halacha Moshe Messinai of the requirement of sirtut is by mezuzahs and by Sefer Torah. Tefillin, it's not there. Kamo mezuzah, rak mishum da'asa lichtav gimel teivos mipasik bli sirtut. It's different. There's a separate halacha that if you write words, it has to have sirtut. And therefore by tefillin, all you have to do is the top line. Meaning, it's not that the whole tefillin needs sirtut. You need a little bit of sirtut in the ksav, so the top line is enough. Meaning, by tefillin, it's more we have to make sure that it's written properly. So as long as you do the top line straight, most people are able to keep the rest of the line straight once the top line is straight. If you don't have any etching, it'll be hard to start it. So by mezuzahs and by mezuzahs and Sefer Torah, it's not a matter of keeping it straight. Every line needs to be written that way. By tefillin, you have to make sure that it's written straight. As long as the top line has sirtut, you're good to go. Now, by the way, if there is no sirtut at all, if you didn't write sirtut at all, the Biur Halacha discusses it, unclear whether it's puzzle. Probably not puzzle by tefillin. That's why also you have to realize tefillin, mezuzahs are not always the same. Sometimes not. And he says, below sirtut. But if, let's say, I don't know how to write one line without sirtut, then you sirtut kol hasharis. Then you should do sirtut by all of them. Below you sirtut ba'oferes, don't use a pen to write sirtut or a pencil because it's going to leave lines. Use a metal instrument that will just indent it. Because if you use a pen to make sirtut, you're going to have it full of lines. And the Mishnah Berurah points out, now b'di'evet, he says it's probably fine. That's the Lechem Chamudas El Yerabah, but Shuvas Dvar Shmuel is unclear because he says, I don't know, if you use a pen as the sirtut, it should be a problem with the Evid. Why? Because the letters are now going to be touching that line. So technically, the letters are not surrounded by klaf, because if I have a pen lining each line, the top of the letters are going to be touching the line, so that should be an issue. Then the Rama adds, I will end with this, B'yesh omim shetzarech l'sarteit tamid l'mayla u'lamata min hatzdadim. The Ashkenazim paskin that you should have sirtot on every line, both the top and the bottom, and on the sides, like a Sefer Torah. Even if you're able to write b'chei noagim, and that's the minig. The minig is to have sirtot in all mamish fully, and that's the minig of Klal Yisrael by tefillin as well.